Imagine living in a neighborhood where one woman controls everything. What color your mailbox can be, how short your grass must be, and even when you take out your trash. Now, imagine standing up to her and watching her lose everything. This is the insane story of how one entitled HOA president pushed too far, got exposed, and had the ultimate meltdown when she lost her power. Stay tuned, because this is a showdown you won't want to miss. If you enjoyed this story and want more jaw-dropping tales of entitled people, drama, and epic showdowns, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another crazy story. More unbelievable content is coming soon. Let's dive in story. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I first heard the sharp, insistent knocking on my front door. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was just a solicitor. But then, the knocking turned into pounding. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whoever was at my door wasn't leaving anytime soon. With a deep breath, I pulled open the door and found myself face to face with the last person I wanted to see, Mrs. Karen Simmons, the self-appointed ruler of our homeowners association. She stood there with her arms crossed, a clipboard clutched in one hand, and an expression of pure entitlement. "Good morning," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "I noticed that your lawn hasn't been trimmed to HOA standards, and I also see some decorations in your backyard that might not be in compliance. I need to do a full inspection to ensure you're following the community guidelines." My jaw clenched. This woman had been a thorn in my side since the day I moved in, always nitpicking and finding reasons to assert her authority. I folded my arms and leaned against the door frame. "With all due respect, Mrs. Simmons, you don't have the right to step onto my property without permission. This is private property." Her eyes widened in disbelief, as if she had never heard the word no before. "Excuse me, I am the HOA president. I have every right to inspect properties in this neighborhood." She tried to step forward, but I firmly blocked her path. "Unless you have a legal warrant or an official complaint filed, you're not setting foot in my yard," I said firmly. Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. Instead, she took a deep breath and narrowed her eyes at me. "We'll see about that," she hissed before turning on her heel and marching away. Something told me this wasn't over. I thought that was the end of it. Maybe Karen would huff and puff, complain to a few neighbors, and then move on to harass someone else. But I underestimated just how petty and vindictive she could be. The next morning, I found a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. HOA violation, failure to maintain property. Aesthetics was printed in bold letters across the top. Beneath it, a long list of supposed infractions: overgrown grass, an unauthorized garden ornament, and a non-HOA approved mailbox. I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous it was. My lawn was neatly trimmed, the garden gnome had been there for years, and my mailbox? Standard issue. This was personal. As I crumpled the notice, I heard a familiar voice from across the street. "You should take it seriously," Karen called out, standing smugly on the sidewalk. She had her phone in hand, no doubt recording for some self-righteous HOA power trip. Ignoring HOA regulations can lead to fines, and if the fines pile up, well, she trailed off with an exaggerated shrug. The message was clear: comply or suffer the consequences. I clenched my fists, my patience wearing thin. "You can't just make up violations because I wouldn't let you onto my property," I shot back. She smirked. "Oh, but I can. The HOA board supports me. And the rules are the rules. If you don't fix these violations in 7 days, there will be penalties." With that, she strutted away, satisfied that she had asserted her dominance. But what she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. If she wanted a battle, I was more than ready to give her one. I grabbed my phone, determined to find a way to fight back. This wasn't just about a fake violation. It was about standing up to a power-hungry HOA president who thought she owned the neighborhood. I spent the next few hours researching my rights as a homeowner. Karen acted like she had unlimited power, but I knew there had to be limits to what she could enforce. After digging through the HOA bylaws, I found something interesting. While the HOA could issue violations, they needed documented proof and approval from the full board before issuing fines. Karen, in her arrogance, had skipped that step. That was my first weapon against her. Feeling emboldened, I decided to push back in the most legal way possible. I drafted an email to the HOA board, attaching photos of my so-called violations, along with copies of the bylaws highlighting Karen's overreach. I also made sure to CC every homeowner in the neighborhood. If Karen wanted a fight, I was going to make sure everyone saw just how unfairly she was running things. Within an hour, my inbox exploded with responses. Some neighbors, clearly afraid of her, stayed silent, but a few brave ones voiced their support. "She did the same thing to me last year," one neighbor replied. "This has to stop," another wrote. Later that evening, as I was watering my lawn, I noticed Karen pacing in her driveway, furiously typing on her phone. No doubt she had seen my email. A few minutes later, she stomped across the street toward me, her face red with anger. "You think you're smart, don't you?" she snapped. "Emailing the whole neighborhood? Trying to turn people against me?" I didn't even flinch. "I'm just making sure everyone knows the rules, including you," I replied calmly. Her jaw tightened, but before she could respond, another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, stepped outside. "Karen, enough," he called out. "You're making a fool of yourself." She spun around, eyes blazing, but before she could argue, she saw more neighbors stepping outside, watching the confrontation unfold. For the first time, she looked nervous, but I knew Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. If anything, this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to something that made my blood boil. A massive bright red sign staked into my front yard. "Warning, HOA violation under review." It was impossible to miss, and worse, it made it look like I was some kind of delinquent homeowner. I yanked the sign out of the ground and marched straight to Karen's house. Before I even knocked, she flung the door open, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on her face. "That sign is coming down, whether you like it or not," I said, holding it up. She let out a dry laugh. "Actually, it stays. The HOA board will be reviewing your case next week. Until then, it's only fair that the community knows you're under violation." Her voice was dripping with fake concern, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted me to snap, but I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I took a deep breath and smirked. Interesting, because I just got off the phone with an attorney who specializes in HOA abuses. Apparently, posting signs like this, without due process, that's considered defamation. And if you don't remove every single one of these signs you put on my lawn, I'll be forced to take legal action. Her face twitched for a split second before she scoffed. "You're bluffing," she muttered, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough for only her to hear. "Try me." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, her confidence visibly shaken. A few hours later, I watched from my window as she hurriedly walked from yard to yard, yanking the signs out of the ground. I knew this wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like she was realizing she had picked the wrong person to mess with. A week later, the HOA board meeting finally arrived. I made sure to be there early, armed with printed copies of the bylaws, my violation notice, and every email exchange I had with Karen. To my surprise, the room was packed. Apparently, my email had stirred up more than I expected. Half the neighborhood had shown up, either to witness the chaos or to finally speak up against Karen's overreach. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in her posture. The HOA board members, most of whom usually rubber-stamped her decisions, looked uneasy. Mr. Thompson, the only board member who had spoken against her before, cleared his throat. "All right, let's address the complaint against Mr. my last name regarding his property violations. Karen, since you issued the violation, you can present your case first." Karen straightened, flipping through her notes. "Yes, well, as you all know, maintaining the aesthetic of our neighborhood is crucial. Mr. my last name has repeatedly ignored HOA guidelines. His grass height was above regulation, his decorations are non-compliant, and his mailbox doesn't match the approved design." She glanced at me with a smirk, as if she had already won. I leaned forward. "With all due respect, that's not true. My lawn is well maintained. My decorations have been in place for years without issue, and my mailbox is the same design as at least 10 other houses in this neighborhood." I slid a stack of photos across the table, showing side-by-side comparisons of my property and others. If my mailbox is a violation, then so are these. The board members examined the photos, murmuring amongst themselves. Karen's face paled slightly. Mr. Thompson nodded. "That's a valid point. Karen, do you have documented proof of these violations before you issued the notice?" Karen stiffened. "Well, I observed them myself, of course." The murmurs grew louder. One of the board members sighed. "Karen, HOA policies require photographic evidence before issuing a violation. Do you have any?" Silence. Karen's face turned red. She had nothing. She had banked on her word, being law, and now, under scrutiny, her case was crumbling. Then I motioned to dismiss this violation. Mr. Thompson said firmly, "And I think we need to discuss the way HOA power is being used here." The crowd murmured in agreement. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but quickly shut it. She knew she had lost this round, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't done yet. I walked out of that HOA meeting feeling victorious, but I knew Karen wasn't the type to take a loss gracefully. Sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to another surprise. This time, an official-looking letter from the HOA, stuffed into my mailbox. The letter claimed that, due to my public disruption at the meeting, I was now under review for violating community harmony standards. I couldn't believe it. She was making up new rules just to come after me. I clenched my fists, but instead of reacting impulsively, I took the letter straight to Mr. Thompson. He glanced over it and sighed. "She's desperate," he muttered. "There's no such thing as a community harmony violation in our bylaws. She's completely overstepping." He looked at me seriously. This might be the final straw to get her removed as HOA president. The idea sparked something in me. Karen had ruled this neighborhood like a dictator for too long, and it was clear she wasn't going to stop unless someone forced her out. So, I spent the next few days gathering signatures from homeowners, many of whom had been quietly fed up with her antics for years. Some were scared to sign, but when I showed them proof of what she had tried to pull on me, they finally agreed. It was time for a change. By the end of the week, I had enough signatures to call for a recall vote. Karen must have caught wind of what was happening because, for the first time, she was eerily silent. No angry emails, no random violations, just silence. But I knew she wasn't going to go down without a fight. The real battle was about to begin. The HOA held a special meeting to address the recall petition, and the atmosphere was electric. Nearly the entire neighborhood had shown up, whispering among themselves. Some were here out of curiosity, others because they had their own grievances against Karen. She sat stiffly at the head of the table, her usual smugness replaced by a nervous glare. She knew she was cornered. Mr. Thompson took the floor. "We're here to vote on whether Karen Simmons should be removed as HOA president due to abuse of power and failure to follow HOA regulations." He glanced at the crowd. "Before we vote, does anyone have anything to say?" I stood up. "Karen has repeatedly issued baseless violations, overstepped her authority, and tried to intimidate homeowners, including me, into compliance with rules that don't even exist. Just last week, she made up a community harmony violation to retaliate against me for challenging her decisions." I held up the letter as murmurs spread through the crowd. "How many of you have been targeted unfairly by Karen?" Hands shot up across the room. One woman stood. "She fined me for having a non-compliant front door, even though it's the same color it's been for 10 years. Another man added, "She tried to tow my car from my own driveway." The stories kept coming, and Karen's face went from red to ghostly pale. Finally, she slammed her hands on the table. "Enough. I have done nothing wrong. I was only enforcing the rules, unlike some of you who think you can do whatever you want." But her voice wavered, and the crowd wasn't buying it. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "All right, it's time to vote. All in favor of removing Karen Simmons as HOA president." A sea of hands shot up. Karen's mouth fell open in shock. She turned frantically to the remaining board members, but even they raised their hands. And those opposed? Not a single hand. "It's decided," Mr. Thompson said, looking straight at Karen. "Effective immediately, Karen Simmons is removed as HOA president." The room erupted into applause. Karen stood frozen, as if her brain couldn't process what had just happened. Then, without a word, she grabbed her bag and stormed out. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I finally felt free. But something told me Karen wasn't done just yet. For a moment, it seemed like everything was finally settling down. With Karen gone from the HOA, the board quickly moved to undo many of her ridiculous policies. Fines were revoked, unnecessary restrictions were lifted, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt normal. But I should have known Karen wouldn't disappear that easily. A few weeks later, I woke up to find my trash cans knocked over, garbage strewn all over my driveway. At first, I thought it was just a random animal, but then I noticed something weird. Only my trash had been targeted. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I checked my security cameras, and sure enough, there she was, Karen, sneaking onto my property in the middle of the night. flipping my bins over like a petty child. I wasn't about to let her get away with this. I called the non-emergency police line and reported her for trespassing and vandalism. When the officer arrived, I showed him the footage, and he nodded. "This is clear-cut harassment," he said. "Would you like to press charges?" As much as I wanted to see her dragged away in handcuffs, I knew that would just make her play the victim. Instead, I had a better idea. "Not yet," I said. "But I do want to file an official report. If she does anything else, I want a paper trail." The officer agreed and went to have a little chat with Karen. Later that day, I watched from my porch as a police car pulled up in front of her house. The officer knocked, and after a few minutes, Karen opened the door. Even from a distance, I could see her expression shift from anger to panic as he spoke. She gestured wildly, probably making excuses, but the officer just shook his head and handed her something, a written warning. The moment he left, Karen turned and saw me watching. For the first time, she looked afraid. She had finally realized she wasn't in control anymore, and if she so much as set foot on my property again, she was going to face real consequences. For a few days, Karen kept her distance. No passive-aggressive notes, no fake violations, no more sneaking onto my property. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally accepted defeat. But then, late one evening, I heard shouting from outside. I stepped onto my porch and found Karen standing in the middle of the street, yelling at the top of her lungs. "You ruined everything," she screeched, pointing a shaking finger at my house. "This neighborhood was perfect before you moved in." Neighbors started peeking out their windows, some even stepping onto their lawns to watch the spectacle unfold. Karen was completely unhinged. "You turned everyone against me," she shrieked. "Do you think you've won?" Her face was red, her eyes wild, and her whole body trembled with rage. I crossed my arms. "Karen, go home." My voice was calm, but firm. The last thing I needed was to stoop to her level in front of the whole neighborhood. But Karen wasn't done. "I hope you regret this." She spat, her voice cracking. "This neighborhood is going to fall apart without me. You'll all see." At that moment, the same police officer from before pulled up. Someone must have called them, probably one of the neighbors, who had finally had enough of her nonsense. The officer stepped out, shaking his head. "Ms. Simmons, we talked about this," he said, his voice tired but firm. "You're disturbing the peace. If you don't go inside right now, you're going to be spending the night in jail." Karen's expression crumbled. She looked around, as if expecting someone to take her side. But no one did. Even the people who once feared her now watched with quiet satisfaction. Finally, she let out a frustrated scream and stomped back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The officer turned to me. "If she bothers you again, just call us. We have more than enough to escalate this if needed." I nodded, thanking him, and as he drove off, I looked around at the gathered neighbors. Some were shaking their heads, others whispering to each other, and then, one by one, they started clapping. Karen had finally lost, and everyone knew it. After that night, Karen became a ghost in the neighborhood. She rarely left her house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact with everyone. The woman who once strutted around like she owned the place now walked with her head down, defeated. It wasn't long before rumors started circulating. She was putting her house up for sale. A few weeks later, a moving truck pulled up in front of her house. Word spread fast, and by the afternoon, A small group of neighbors gathered outside to watch her leave. She stepped out one last time, her face pale and tight with anger, but she didn't say a word. She simply got into her car and sped off, leaving behind the neighborhood she had once controlled. The HOA, now under Mr. Thompson's leadership, began undoing all of Karen's unnecessary rules. The ridiculous restrictions on decorations, grass height, and mailboxes were removed. People were free to enjoy their homes without fear of some power-hungry tyrant breathing down their necks. And for the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt like a community again. As I stood on my porch, watching the moving truck drive away, one of my neighbors walked up to me and grinned. "You really took her down, huh?" I chuckled. She did it to herself. Entitlement and power don't last forever, especially when people stand up to it. Karen thought she was untouchable, but in the end, all it took was someone willing to challenge her, to bring her reign to an end. Message to readers and viewers: if you're dealing with someone like Karen in your life, don't be afraid to stand your ground. Bullies thrive on fear and control, but when people unite and push back, they always fall. Stay strong and never let entitled people walk all over you.